A lot of authors wrote about Erich Fromm since Rainer Funk started to publish the complete edition in 1980. Unfortunately, numerous misunderstandings and misinterpretations by former colleagues of the Frankfurt Institute of Social Research and by orthodox psychoanalysts were often passed down to their students and to journalists without any critical review until today. My main question has always been what can be proven and what cannot. The remainder is to be questioned. With my contributions to research related to Fromm, I used to confront Fromm with all his different critics and various opinions to get a realistic view, to show the differences and the reasons for these differences. Fromm's interdisciplinary approach is often hard to be categorized. He's often called a social philosopher. It would be more precise to call him a social psychologist, because the focus of his publications was on psychoanalytic social psychology. He himself called it analytic social psychology in the 30s. In addition, he was a therapist in practice for almost 50 years, also a teacher in psychoanalysis, and he significantly enhanced Sigmund Freud's psychoanalysis development. He was also one of the most influential and clear-sighted social critics of the 20th century, that what we can evaluate much easier today with a certain distance through history rather than during his lifetime. However, statements and evaluations of his significance are still very far apart. Despite many publications, it is still necessary today to free Fromm of many misunderstandings in order to make it possible to evaluate his life and work realistically. In my lecture, I have to limit my contributions to a few facts which were most often misunderstood and misrepresented. First, about life and work. When I finished my dissertation, Religion in the Work of Erich Fromm, in 1989, I had to write, "We don't know enough details to get a precise picture of the man, the person Erich Fromm." That has changed significantly since then. Nowadays, we have a lot of information collected within the Erich Fromm archive, and meanwhile, except of some of the Fromm private letters, publications by Rainer Funk and others. So it is possible to get a clear view on Fromm's life. Rainer Funk's biographic publications are always the most knowledgeable, indispensable for all the biographers, and his statements are factually justified as far as I could evaluate. But even before Funk's Funk's book of 1999, which the picture biography, there are quite valuable biographies about Fromm and his life. For instance, the one of Daniel Burstyn from 1991 and Helmut Wehr, 1995, providing a profound understanding of both the man and his work. Alfred Levy's Erich Fromm from 2002, a work biography from the point of view of an Adlerian. Is it right, Adlerian? An Adler's scholar? Adler? Yeah.
Adlerian.
Thank you. Contains, beside a lot of correct information, unfortunately also some misinterpretations, which others follow. For example, that Fromm wished for a renaissance of matriarchy instead of a dialectic synthesis of patriarchy and matriarchy. In addition, he does not divulge his most important influences, such as of William Reich. So he says William Reich was headmaster of his first ideas, but which I could not confirm either. Fromm did not only know Reich personally, he also knew about his Freudian and Marxist psychoanalysis. It's true, Reich made a Freudian Marxist synthesis before Fromm did. That's true. But Reich himself wrote in his life memories he gave up quite quickly, trying to convince Fromm of his views. Fromm gratefully accepted one or more ideas for his therapeutic work, Reich's ideas, as he did from many other psychoanalysts, which was obvious given his openness. Additionally, Lewy is one of the authors who did not understand Fromm's definition of religion and who attempts to explain Fromm's religiousness from a typical inferiority complex present in religious people. This is reductionistic in a negative sense of the word. Fromm himself provides, as far as I see it, clear statements about the character of his basic religiousness. There are, besides the description of his relationships to the parents and his socialization in a completely Jewish environment, quote, the anxiety about the existential dichotomies of life, his desires, the word, seem as torn apart place, to want to experience and live it as one and as a wholesome person. So the quote was, the anxiety about the existential dichotomies of life, quote ending, his desires, the word, seen as a torn apart place to want to experience and live as one and a wholesome person, and a deeply felt desire to overcome isolation. In 2030, the American historian Lawrence Friedman, supported by his assistant Anke Schreiber, summarized his biographical knowledge, including a lot of quotes of Fromm's letters collected in Tübingen, and a lot of information from interviews he had with several people who knew Fromm quite well during the last 10 years, even with Michael McCovey. On one hand, Friedman's biography is excellent and a milestone. In no other book you can find more details about Fromm's life. On the other hand, it's full of unnecessary speculations and errors. The two main reasons for that are Friedman does not speak or read German, so he misses important information which he could have obtained through publications by, for instance, Wolfgang Bons, Rolf Wiggershaus, Helmut Wehr, Burkhard Bierhoff, Rainer Funk, and me, for example. Some of the major factual mistakes have luckily been carefully corrected by the translator team who made the German version. For this reason, the German translation differs quite pleasantly from the American original, and obviously without changing Friedman's book too much. Secondly, Friedman has a strong tendency towards gossip stories and speculations about Fromm's private life, even if there is no evidence for such. And at last but not least, Friedman, a historian, brings us a lot of bad psychology in his book, and a lot of misunderstandings of, for instance, of the social character and of the different views of Freud and Fromm. For instance, he says that the idea of biophilia and necrophilia is the same thing as eros and thanatos by Freud. That isn't true. Friedman succeeds in summarizing Fromm's most important work in a compact way. However, it loses some of its original content by doing so. Of course, always does. In addition, he avoids almost the discussion of topic Fromm is dealing with and neglects respective secondary literature and history of Fromm's ideas outside of the political sphere of the United States of the 50s and 60s, which he describes very vividly. However, he cannot be blamed for this, as it was not his goal. His topic was Fromm as a person and individual. His image of Fromm, which he created, is a little bit different from that of Rainer Funk, who knows Fromm's best without doubt. and the image of Fromm that I have obtained during the many years of working in Fromm research. It seems to show numerous discontinuities with Fromm. Funk and I believe to have good reasons to identify astonishingly great continuity in Fromm's life and work. Second remark, Fromm's role within the Institute for Social Research. Some critics of Fromm's would like to connect a scientific Fromm of the publications of his time at the Institute for Social Research in the 30s, sometimes to a Fromm of Escape from Freedom, which means Fromm of the early 40s, to the later, less critical, supposedly unscientific moralizer. They praise the significance of methods and results of his analytic social psychology, his theory of the character of society, and the family as agency of society, of the social character. And the family as agency of society. They do not know or omit the facts that Fromm, instead of Adorno, created the terminology of the authoritarian character, its definition, and the very first empirical social study in Germany about the attitudes and opinions of workers and employees. Many critics who want to distinguish a scientific Fromm from the later Fromm do not recognize that although his language changed, his opinion and skills in analysis without illusion did not. When, for example, not the time for examples. I'm going on. So there are a lot of people who correct this picture. Rolf Wiggershaus is the most important. He was the first author who truthfully and correctly described the role of Erich Fromm at the Institute for Social Research in his book The Frankfurt School, Geschichte, theoretische Entwicklung und so weiter. Martin Jai did that already in part in Dialektische Fantasie in 1976, and notably shared certain biases of the Frankfurt School towards Fromm and did not know of all the facts yet. Wiggershaus was followed by with additional insightful details about the intentional omission, Burkhard Bierhoff called it, and new evaluations of Fromm's important role for the critical theory. For instance, by Burkhard Bierhoff, Helmut Joach, Daniel Bursten, Rainer Funk, and me. Because we had the access to the complete work and the complete letters exchanged between Horkheimer and Fromm, Adorno, and Landauer. The same applies to Friedman, who accurately describes the development leading to Fromm's departure from the Institute and also uses the exchange of letters intensively. Horkheimer and Adorno even went so far to falsify the history of the Institute in order to hide Fromm's role. In its preface for the publication of speeches of the speaker series on Freud in der Gegenwart, Freud in the present time, at the universities of Frankfurt and Heidelberg in 1956, Horkheimer and Adorno wrote, quote, "Since its foundation in the period prior to 1933, the Institute included psychoanalysis in its work and particularly in its strict Freudian method." That's correct. Then the text continues, quote, "From the very beginning there was a psychoanalytic division at the Institute managed by Karl Landauer, who died in Bergen-Belsen and was a student of Freud." That is not true. The head of the division was between 1930 and 1939 Erich Fromm. The following sentence, quote, "The Zeitschrift für Sozialforschung, magazine for social research, contained in its first edition a programmatic essay about the task of analytic social psychology." That is correct. It was written by Erich Fromm. That, however, is not said. Without mentioning the name of Erich Fromm, it goes on, quote, "Empirical studies of the Institute have then been carried out for years, quote, end. He was also not mentioned in relation to the volumes Studien zu Autorität und Familie, studies about authority and family, published in Paris in 1936, and the preliminary results listed therein by Erich Fromm, together with Hilde Weiss starting in 1929, which means prior to the foundation of the Institute for Social Research. Not the foundation, but the beginning of Horkheimer's work as director, and before Fromm joined in, which were social psychology studies on empirical basis drafted and created by themselves and then executed as a member of the Institute on Opinions of Workers and Cell-Right Employees. Martin Jai found out first in his pioneering description of the history of the Institute that Fromm, quote, quickly became an important figure, the most important figure for that, and, quote, and that he became the head of the social psychology division for life, officially in 1931. For about 8 years to 9 years, quote, as long as Fromm's role in the as long as Fromm's role as the expert remained untouched at the Institute, one relied mostly more or less on the concepts developed by him, quote ending. It is a fact that the study The Authoritarian Personality, 1950 in New York, I think, a piece for which Theodor Adorno gets most of the credits, who contributed the theoretical part to the results of the various study groups, laid the groundwork, as it is stated here, however, again, without mentioning the name of Erich Fromm. And finally, the name Fromm is not listed particularly even when he is meant in the preface I quoted. And when towards the end of the short preface it said, quote, the psychoanalytic revisionism of various schools advocating stronger consideration of so-called substantial factors in comparison to the supposedly exaggerated Freudian statements did not only soften the greatest findings of Freud, the role of early childhood development, the suppression of, and yes, even the central term of the unconscious. Erich Fromm did none of that. Instead, it embraced the trivial common sense, the societal conformism, and lost his critical sharpness. Quote, these accusations are made to Erich Fromm by his colleagues, by his former colleagues, and kept on the support no matter what the facts are. Horkheimer, Adorno, and later also Marcuse, starting 1955 with In Eros and Civilization, as well as the supporters of the orthodox psychoanalysis, accused Fromm of revisionism. Once this term is mentioned, one knows immediately this is not about science, but about religious or political wars. Revisionism is, as well known, no scientific category. It is actually the opposite. Science is all about testing a theory, improve it, change it, or abandon it if necessary. But at the time it was all about religious, political wars, about interpretative power, and certainly about vanity and positions, about money, about power and influence. Today it is obvious that Horkheimer and Adorno, partially through fearful opportunism, because they shield away from the conflict of the then forming psychoanalytic orthodoxy, but also feared that the individual could, without its exposing instinct-driven base, which Freud assumes, cannot be protected against the manipulation, and finally loses his individuality. So I have to go on a little bit faster. Something else shall be remarked. Until today, the Frankfurt School, as I could prove a few years ago when I went to an exhibition they had at the University at Frankfurt about the history of the Frankfurt School and the Institute of Social Research, they try to bring Fromm out of the Institute's history. In this exhibition you could see Erich Fromm only at a group of people who was at the beginning of the Institute, who was in the around the Institute, but they always say that Adorno from the beginning were partner of Horkheimer at the Institute of Social Research, and that's untrue. Adorno joined the Institute in 1938. The facts that his colleagues of the Institute, none of them was a psychoanalyst, suddenly defended the orthodox psychoanalysis against Fromm had, according to his rightful impression, quote from Fromm's letter to Martin Jai, also partially to do with the influence of Adorno, who I criticized harshly from the first day when he appeared in New York. Fromm and Adorno did not like each other, in addition to their differences in opinions. Adorno ridiculed it. Adorno called Fromm in Frankfurt secretly a professional Jew, and Fromm detested Adorno's aesthetic elitism. Both were in this phase of their lives quite narcissistic, and both wanted Horkheimer's attention. Fromm felt very much that Adorno tried to eliminate him off Horkheimer's side. It can indeed be shown by the Horkheimer exchange of letters quite accurately that and how Adorno tried to push away anyone out of the Institute since 1935 in order to take over his or her place. Only his, because there was no woman there at that time. First, it was Herbert Marcuse, but then he began to undermine Fromm's position of trust within Horkheimer's through subtle criticism. I have a lot of quotes about that, but you can read them afterwards. Fromm left the Institute in 1939 voluntarily. The statement that one has let him go was also part of the later legendary stories, if one could not avoid admitting that Erich Fromm once had something to do with the Institute. Fromm's role at the Institute of Social Research must, according to the research findings by Jai, Bons, and Wiggershaus, be completely re-evaluated. For a long time, Marcuse's and Adorno's statements about Fromm have dominated the opinions of influential intellectuals. Einflussreich, das sagt man mal in Englisch.
Influential.
Yeah, influential intellectuals. That is nearby impossible even until today to provide a factual evaluation of the opposite. Jürgen Habermas wanted in his theory of Theorie des kommunikativen Handelns to go back, that was in 1981, go back to the interdisciplinary approach of the critical theory, and wanted to go back to Fromm a little bit, but he did not go on this way until now. Third remark, psychoanalysis. Fromm's work is about a lifelong respectful throughout but also critical examination of the person and the thoughts of Sigmund Freud. He wrote to Martin Jai in 1971, I always remained a Freudian. Only in the last years it became clearer how important the significance of Erich Fromm really was for the psychoanalysis theory. He was accused of revisionism for a long time, and his approach was dismissed. He was even excluded of the EPA in the 50s. But this only shows that psychoanalysis, for a long time, looked more like a sect rather than a science. With most of his revisions and departures from Fromm was only ahead of his time, which caught up with him step by step. Additionally, only the publications by Rainer Funk after his death made clear that the mainly unknown therapist Fromm was also ahead of his time in many ways. His position have mostly become accepted by now. Let me see. I have to read the rest. The analyst Johannes Cremerius of Freiburg wrote in the 80s, "It is a curious aspect of this history of the psychoanalysis that to the extent in which first the Psychoanalytic Institute of Berlin and later London committed to the orthodox limitedness, also Freud got himself more and more into the position of the dissident. Which means, for example, that the third and last concept of psychological actions, the formulating of the structure theory of 23, was no longer added by many analysts. They insisted to earlier positions of the theory and with that to earlier methods of treatment. In addition, the Institute's reasoned with a rigor in education was opposite of a liberal generosity of Freud himself. And finally, he did not comply with the basic fundamental guidelines for treatment practices he created between 1910 and 1940. So Freud himself was the first dissident. He was no Freudian at all. Cremerius also stated that psychoanalysis became more open in the past 40 years since Freud's death. Quote, under the same roof includes and tolerates them all the theory of Melanie Klein, the supporters of the Daseinsanalyse, the theories about the pre-Oedipal phase of development, and so on and so on. It would also include and tolerate those who left voluntary, like the supporters of the cultural interpersonal school of psychoanalysis, Horney, Fromm, Thompson, Sullivan, and others. Seen from a point of view of today, just the lastly mentioned theory seems to be less distant from Freud's main aspects, much less distant than others still considering groups under the same roof, wrote Cremerius. The statement above is very accurate, but it sounds like mockery that the neo-Freudian left the psychoanalytic community voluntarily. They were dropped, they were thrown out. Yeah? They did not do it. They were pushed out or thrown out. Unfortunately, then, Cremerius' essay, which started so full of hope, ended with reflects of the conformism of the NeoFreudians. Finally, in the past 20 years, a strong trend can be identified to get over old trench warfare and to view the different perspective as complementarity instead of exclusively correct. Tsvetan Todorov, who wrote a book worth reading about general anthropology, distinguished between in the psychoanalysis two subtraditions. Quote, one that can be traced back to Ferenczi, opposed to Freud's father orientation, and emphasizes the relationships formed during the pre-Oedipal phase between mother and child, again connected to Bachhoffen's speculations about the right of the mother, discovers her as the origin of individual life as relationships free of conflicts. As deep as one goes into the human spirit, one will never find one isolated being, but only relationships to other beings. Quote ending. He lists Alice and Michael Balint as the most significant supporters of this movement. Second quote, the other subtradition has its origins in the Marxist criticism of the Freud theory and the Freudian Erich Fromm the Freudian, in Erich Fromm, the social, culture-based and feminist critic Karen Horney, and finally the interpersonal psychiatry of Sullivan, quote ending. They were then joined by peculiar psychologists of the self who also built up a close cooperation with them. Fromm also brought attention to the different aspects of the Freudian model, the fallback of the economic model. Todorov has these two different sub-traditions, but he is quite right, but as you all will see, Fromm does not, Fromm's legitimacy needs to be considered as one of both groups. He is a forethinker of both of these sub-traditions in real. So, last remark, psychology of religion. The topic of religion claims a large and important portion of Fromm's work. Many of his critics expressed lack of understanding in his enormous interest in religion. They considered this as a fallback into childhood, or even as counter-intelligence. The trend in society in the 60s through the 80s made religion appear to many intellectuals as something anachronistic, which may be of short duration. They were wrong, obviously. Fromm has, as a psychologist of religion, important things to say. It has, however, not been received respectively by neither the theological side nor by the science of religion. He created a successful synthesis of religious psychology thoughts of Freud and Jung, which he enhances through his own corrections and views. Particularly in the area of character orientation, the terminology and understanding of social characters, and his analysis of narcissism and group narcissism of religions, he can provide important impulses. In addition, his psychological definition of religion provides helpful new perspectives for a known, difficult to define phenomenon. Fromm has, in contrast to what many critics claim, never given up his religiously critical positions, as he describes them in former paper, The Dogma of Christ, in 1930. In 1963, he wrote in a preface for the American first edition of this essay, "My views did not change, but today I would also emphasize the point of view that the history of religion reflects the spiritual and mental development of humans." Quote. Fromm is not a defendant of religion, as it is often misunderstood. He wants to benefit from it, like Ernst Bloch. He does not take away any iota of the Freudian, the Feuerbach, or the Marx criticism of religion. In contrary, he agrees with it. But, in contrast to Freud, he considers religions as an ambivalent phenomenon in which constructive aspects can be found as well, while Freud, as a human being influenced by the rationalistic scientific ideals of the second half of the 19th century, as Fromm explains, only recognized what Fromm called authoritarian religion. Fromm was a post-metaphysical thinker. He interpreted all ontology in English. Ontological statements of all mystics, theologians, founders of religions and philosophers, consequently into inner psychological ones. So this is post-metaphysisches Denken. Fromm only fought against projections he considered harmful. Humanistic projections, which take into consideration the respective state of means of finding as reality-oriented and holistic reasonably, can help to grow to a higher level to be free and happy, he claimed. He examined the history of religions always with one basic question: where one can find authority or where humanistic tendencies in these religions. He also was a supporter of the feminist perspective, by distinguished between matriarchal and patriarchal religion long before feminist theology and also philosophy development. Surprisingly, until today, there is not one single professorship anywhere in Germany for the psychology of religion. And in my own department, my own science of religion studies, the psychology of religion is still leading a marginal existence. Thank you.